Thank you all so much for joining us, both in person and online. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. I want to thank the Corning Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event. Corning Life Sciences, based right here in Tewksbury, recently donated $5,000 to the library for virtual and in-person author visits, so we thank them for their generosity. If anyone has any cell phones in the room, they want to turn those to vibrate or silent. Restrooms are down the hall on the right before you. Lasting approximately an hour. Lauren has going to do a brief reading and then some slides and then take some audience questions. And then for those who are interested, there'll be a selling and signing. I do want to thank Debbie and Dan from the Book Oasis in Stoneham for being here tonight and for being our official bookstore partner. All right. For those watching at home, as a reminder, I believe the comments on YouTube are disabled tonight, so if you do have a comment or a question you want to email me for Lauren, it's rhayes, R-H-A-Y-E-S, at tewksburypl.org. And if you email me your comment or question, I'll make sure to ask it, okay? And I feel like I'm forgetting something really obvious, but I guess we're just going to get right into it, and hopefully I remember. Okay, so today's ironically I'm forgetting things, right? Yeah. This program is for me in more ways than one here. So today's program is The Memory Thief and the secrets behind how we remember. And I literally asked Lauren about 60 seconds ago how to pronounce her last name, and I have forgotten. So that's again. I think this talk is really speaking to me here. So author Lauren Aguirre. Okay. So author Lauren Aguirre is here to discuss her recent, critically acclaimed book, The Memory Thief, and the secrets behind how we remember a medical mystery, which was a finalist, this is a big deal, folks, was a finalist for this year's Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. So Lauren is an award-winning science journalist who has produced documentaries, short-form video series, podcasts, interactive games, and blogs for the PBS series Nova. We all love Nova, right? Who doesn't love Nova? Yeah. Lauren has covered everything from asteroids to human origins to art restoration, but is particularly fascinated by the brain. Her articles on memory and addiction have appeared in Stat, the Boston Globe Ideas section, Undark, The Atlantic, The Scientist, PBS, and in many other places. And tonight's book, again, is entitled The Memory Thief. I'm looking forward to learning more about it. So all 12 of us or so in the room and the hundreds and thousands watching at home, let's give a big round of applause to Lauren for joining us here tonight.
All right, well, this is really exciting, even though there's only 12 of you, because this is my first in-person audience. The book was published a year ago, but I had to do everything virtually. So it's really wonderful to see the people I'm talking to and not just in little squares or on the radio or what have you. Before I get started, I wanted to thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in the Program for Public Understanding of Science and Technology. They were very generous in supporting the research and writing of this book. So The Memory Thief is a story about a cluster of people who overdosed on opioids, and although they survived the overdose, they, in the process, damaged a tiny piece of the brain called the hippocampus, which is essential for forming new memories. They damaged that part and no other part of the brain, which is extremely unusual. So when they woke up, they had amnesia. And most of them never recovered the ability to form new memories. So the first few patients, so doctors were really interested in finding out why this happened to them, why just them, and how many other people were out there, but also what could they learn about memory and how memory works and how we could protect memories from understanding what happened to these people. So it's a story that illuminates many other stories. It's a story about how medical science advances, what the barriers are to advancements in medical science, how we know what we think we know about memory, and also the prospects for a treatment for Alzheimer's. But I will start with, at the beginning, with the short reading. On the first Friday of October, Barish leans forward in his chair and stares at the MRI scan on his monitor. He's looking at the brain of a young man admitted to the hospital last night, and the image is so strange and beautiful that he knows something has to be wrong. "Whoa," he says out loud to his empty office. "This is weird." Floating brightly against the darker background of the rest of the brain are two C-shaped structures tucked on either side of the central fluid-filled cavity. Together, they make up the hippocampus, the place that holds the keys to memory, and the intense glow is a distress signal from many millions of cells. Some mysterious marauding force has laid waste to just this tiny region, leaving the rest of the brain unharmed. Barish looks out his door to the still quiet waiting room up on the 7th floor at Leahy Hospital and Medical Center in Burlington, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. Then he looks back at the monitor. Last night's phone call from nearby Winchester Hospital requesting permission to transfer this patient suddenly makes more sense. The distraught 22-year-old had recently overdosed. He was dragging one leg and repeatedly asking his mother if he was dying. Winchester is a smaller hospital that handles routine emergencies like a broken wrist or an appendicitis. But when patients with complex conditions or unexplained symptoms come in, the staff will often send them over to Leahy, a facility that has hundreds of specialists and more equipment. With a high-quality image in front of him, Barish can see what the Winchester staff could not, and it explains why the patient was acting strangely. In 10 years of medical training, Barish has reviewed thousands of scans, brains shrunken from Alzheimer's disease, brains dotted with tiny broken blood vessels, brains with tumors in different sizes, shapes, and locations. In every case, no matter what the damage looked like, it was pretty clear what was going on. But what Barish sees on the screen in front of him is strange and alien, belonging to no category he can imagine. It looks like someone took a page out of his medical school neuroanatomy textbook and deliberately highlighted the brain's memory center. He re-examines the MRI, scrolling up from the base of the skull through the familiar soft gray brain structures until the hippocampus comes back into view. It seems certain that this patient will fail the memory test they'll give him. Strange cases and rare brain diseases. He believes more in chance than in destiny, but still, he thinks, it's almost as if his years of study and obsession have guided him directly to this moment, sitting in this office, looking at this startling image. So that little red parentheses right in the middle there is the hippocampus, just to give you a map, as it were, and that's sitting right on top of the brain stem, and that person is looking off that way. So that's the frontal lobe on that side of the screen. So this is what Max's brain scan looked like, and this view is from the crown of the head down through to the feet. And so those squiggly, bright lines, that's the hippocampus. And it's the rest of the brain tissue is gray because it's unharmed. So in this particular type of scan, anything that is bright white is damaged. But it's a signal that fades quickly. And so by a week, it's gone, because even though the brain is still damaged, the sort of immediate problem with blood not flowing correctly has disappeared. And that's what this type of scan measures. So if you don't get this scan quickly, you'll never find this evidence. So Max Meehan was identified in 2012, and Jed Barish and other doctors at Leahy had no idea what to make of it. They'd never seen a patient like this. They looked in the literature. They'd never seen anyone else. He said he'd overdosed on heroin. So Barish sort of filed it away in the back of his mind as something strange and unusual but unanswerable until 3 years later in 2015 when a man from New Hampshire came down to see him for a second opinion. And he had stayed home alone one weekend while his family went away. And when they called to check in, he suddenly wasn't making any sense. He was repeating himself over and over again, couldn't remember what they'd said 30 seconds earlier. So when he came in, Barish took the history, and although he denied using drugs on that weekend, he did have a history of heroin use. Still, Barish wasn't really thinking about Max because the radiologist in New Hampshire hadn't said that there was anything strange about the MRI. But this is what the MRI looked like, exactly like Max's. So now he had 2 cases, 3 years apart. The only common link is overdose, probably opioids. But what's changed? People have been overdosing on heroin for decades. And these are the first 2 cases that they were aware of. Well, 2012 was the beginning of the fentanyl epidemic here in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, we were on the leading edge of that. So sort of his gut hunch instinct was, could that be the missing link? Could these men have taken fentanyl unwittingly, which still happens today? Fentanyl is mixed in with heroin. It's also mixed in often with street pills like Xanax, so people don't know that they're taking it. So they went back and looked through Leahy records and found 2 more patients. They were women, but had the same exact circumstances. And then the Department of Public Health took notice and sent out an alert to all doctors in the state of Massachusetts saying, have you seen a patient like this? And within minutes, they started hearing back from people who, like Barish, had seen someone, didn't know what to make of it, and kind of filed it away in the back of their mind. So fentanyl, just briefly, is an opioid that is 50 times more potent than heroin. It was actually invented in the 60s as an anesthetic and is still used safely in 80 to 90% of surgeries every day around the world. But 4 cases wasn't enough to really go on here. So this was the first case that they got back. I was involved in such a case of a 49-year-old patient. He was found confused and amnestic, imaging with bilateral hippocampal injury, that's both sides of the brain, and tox screen positive for opiates, which he denied taking. So they wound up with a total of 14 of these patients, and all of them had a history of opioid use or had taken opioids, but still no one had tested positive for fentanyl. So what's this hunch? And also, why did they care so much about finding out what caused it? And one of the reasons is when something injures the brain or you have some sort of strange case that has never happened before, that's telling you that there's something new you don't know about the brain, about how the system works. And so understanding that could give insight that could be useful for understanding the brain or memory formation in general, and not just being able to give these victims sort of at least the dignity of a diagnosis. So they sent out another request, a second request, asking if doctors saw patients like this, could they please test for fentanyl, which is not normally done. It's expensive. You have to send it out to a lab, and it costs a lot. And you also have to do it really quickly because fentanyl, unlike other opioids, clears the system very, very quickly. So like the MRI scan, if you don't act right away, you're going to lose the evidence. So it was a very difficult problem to solve. So when they found these additional 4 patients, and they also found a patient in West Virginia with fentanyl, it was pretty clear that it was either that drug or a contaminant. And then they heard from a doctor in Canada who'd seen a woman who was using fentanyl patches as prescribed for pain control. And this happened to her as well. So that was pharmaceutical grade fentanyl, not a street drug, not a contaminant. And this is a journal entry that she wrote, feeling even more confused today, no sense of time, anxious, feel like I'm in a fog, 3:30 p.m., have to keep reading my journal, whiteboard, to remember anything. Memory does not hold. So now they kind of understood what this syndrome is, that fentanyl is causing it. What can that tell them about what other problems opioids might be causing? So opioids are prescribed for chronic pain to millions of people, and some of them for months at a time at very high doses. So the sort of obvious question is, if fentanyl can cause this really severe sudden damage, is it causing much more subtle memory problems in people who are taking them as prescribed long term? So this isn't, you got your wisdom teeth out and you got hydrocodone for 3 days. This is months and months. So because they had this new amnestic syndrome, they had sort of a basis for looking into that problem. And anecdotally, many doctors will say their patients complain of memory problems. So the NIH has now funded a grant as a result of this work, and they're working at UPenn with pain patients, comparing people who take opioids versus people who use other treatments for pain to see, is their hippocampus getting smaller, and is their memory suffering in sort of subtle ways that you can't quantify without actually doing an experiment. So that's one outcome that's being examined. I did promise 10 or 12 minutes ago to talk about Alzheimer's as well. So you might be wondering what this syndrome has to do with Alzheimer's. Well, it's the same part of the brain that is damaged first in most cases of Alzheimer's, the hippocampus. And because that's responsible for memory, that's why the symptoms for most people are memory problems. And then the disease spreads from there to other parts of the brain, and you begin to get problems with speech and planning and eventually with movement. So there are many forms of dementia. Alzheimer's is the most common one. It's 1 in 3 people at the age of 85 or over. I mean, it's a sad story, so I sort of hate going over these statistics, but 6 million people in the United States. In 2050, there'll be, I think the estimate is 13 or 14 million, cost trillions of dollars, and there's no effective treatment or cure. So we don't know what causes Alzheimer's, but we do know that the definition of the disease is that you have these 2 toxic proteins that accumulate and cause the damage. One are called tau tangles, and they build up inside neurons and kill them. And this was seen in the very first patient that Alois Alzheimer studied. And then the second one, but this is sort of the cousin that no one really pays attention to. The second one, and the one many of you have probably heard about, are amyloid beta plaques. And those are the little pink things. And they kind of build up between cells and interfere with communication. So amyloid beta has sort of been the star of the field of Alzheimer's in terms of what causes it and how to treat it. So going back 30 years, that was the theory. Amyloid beta builds up, kills cells, cuts off communication. So if you get rid of amyloid beta, you can treat Alzheimer's. And that's the basis of the drug Aduhelm that Biogen released last year to great controversy because it actually didn't show that it worked. So it's unclear why it was approved, and it actually can hurt people too, which is not to say that it doesn't work, it's just they didn't have the evidence. And so that's why I think Medicaid has not approved paying for it, and anyway, it's been very controversial. So that's the bad news. The good news is every scientist I spoke with said, I'm actually hopeful for the first time because there's sort of a sea change in the field despite the sort of tyranny of this amyloid beta theory, which most scientists I spoke to also complained about that. And this happens in many fields of science, that everyone looks under the spotlight and no one looks kind of out there. And it really is pretty sad that 30 years and dozens of failed trials have all been going after this one thing. But people are changing now. They're looking at lots of different things, and one is to reduce hyperactivity in the hippocampus. So this is a feature that for many years people thought was sort of compensatory as your brain is starting to falter and these bad proteins are building up. Maybe this hyperactivity in the hippocampus is making it easier for the hippocampus to work. But in fact, it's like static in the background, and it actually impedes the formation of strong memories. And they also now know that it can release tau, which would contribute further to developing tau tangles. And what's interesting is that they have found those tau tangles also in chronic heroin users, which is another link with the amnestic syndrome. So there's a clinical trial that is going to be, the results are due to be announced in November, using a specially formulated off-the-shelf drug that's used to treat epilepsy, because epilepsy is also a disease where the neurons are hyperactive. And so if that works, and scientists have been burned hundreds of times, but if that works, it's a great alternative to the current treatments, which are injections. This would be a once-a-day pill. Another treatment that I looked at was about strengthening gamma rhythms. So there's lots of rhythms in your brain of different frequencies. One of them is gamma, and that's associated with paying attention. And they found that when they strengthen that rhythm simply by shining flickering light at 40 hertz or playing sound that's flickering at 40 hertz, they call it pink noise, so it sounds a little like white noise. They could strengthen those brain rhythms. And in mice don't get Alzheimer's, but they can get something like Alzheimer's. Those plaques went away. The microglia, which are the cells that clean up your brain and get rid of debris, they got bigger and they turned into their house cleaning roles. And most importantly, their memories got better. They were able to kind of find their way out of a maze or find the hidden platform in a pool of water, which is a typical way that scientists check to see whether mice remember something. And then another thing I covered in the book was, it sounds kind of gruesome, but it's called parabiosis. And basically, they sew two mice together, one young, one old, so that their blood is shared. And then they found that the old mouse gets a little younger and the young mouse gets a little older, but basically the old mouse definitely gets the better deal, and their memory improves. So, but there's tons of factors circulating in the blood. What might it be? Or it might be multiple factors. So this one scientist zeroed in on an enzyme that is released by the liver when you exercise, and exercise is known to be good for reducing the risk of Alzheimer's. So their hope, and this is way, way further down the line, is that if they can sort of make that exercise in a pill, because not everyone can exercise, and again, reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. So, to be realistic, no one's talking about a cure anytime soon, but they are talking about treatments, and it might be a combination of treatments, or it might be for different types of Alzheimer's, different treatments. But it seems like they see a light at the end of the tunnel. And in the meantime, anything that people can do to protect their health in general is going to help reduce the risk of Alzheimer's, because your brain is part of your body, and if your brain is healthy, it's better able to withstand the insults of Alzheimer's. So I kind of rushed through that, but now you have more time for questions. So you have a question.
1 second, let me have folks hold the mic so folks at home can move. Sorry, you caught me off guard.
I also didn't talk about the science of memory at all, even though it's in the book, because I didn't think I had time. That's a very big topic. But
So I have a couple different questions.
Test. Okay, sorry.
Okay. No, it's fine. One is, with the hyperactivity and things like that, is there any correlation between that type of hyperactivity in the brain and people with ADD, ADHD? Is there any sort of link between those that the studies might be able to help out?
no, not that I'm aware of. I think it's a different type of hyperactivity. It's not like the person is hyperactive. It's just in the hippocampus, the neurons are firing too frequently.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other one, the mice got me. Do they find the same, or have they even tried the results doing transfusions as opposed to sewing them together? Like if they were to do
Interesting.
almost a full blood transfusion from a younger mouse to an older mouse, do they get the same results?
They do, but they don't want to start that way because they would have to sacrifice a lot more mice. I mean, this sounds really barbaric, but you wind up using fewer mice or killing fewer mice. So
Could you mix like blood from 10 young mice? Sorry, I'm just thinking.
Maybe, I know, it's like,
because as humans, we do transfusions a lot
Yes.
for accidents and things like that.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, if somebody was in that situation, could they raid a blood bank, as it were, and take blood from multiple donors to potentially save one older person?
So actually, there was a company in San Francisco that tried that. Like basically, for $8,000, they took the young blood, the blood from a young person, and put it in people who weren't much older but had lots of money. But that eventually got shut down. They really need to know what the factors are, and find a way to mass produce them to make it sort of possible in the real world.
Any other questions?
Well, I do, but if other people have questions, I can share the love.
Yeah, anyone have any questions for Lauren? Keep going. Keep going.
All right.
I saw in the introduction you had an issue. Recover their memories?
So some of them got better, but most of them either passed away or just sort of were lost to follow-up is the phrase, like they didn't come back for appointments. But there was one patient who I followed in great detail because he was very generous to kind of share his story with me. And he still has, short-term memories, kind of the colloquial word. He has a memory of someone with advanced Alzheimer's. He's 28 now, but he still has, the rest of his brain is not damaged, and it's not going to be damaged. And he has incredible executive function. So he writes lists, he writes everything down. In fact, he wrote everything down even before he overdosed because he was afraid, ironically, of losing his memory. Now he's lost his memory, but he still survives, and in fact, he's going to graduate school. So he really turned his life around, and he's been sober for 4 years. So, question back there?
Thanks.
How do those over-the-counter memory pills, do they have any effect on anything that you're referring to? You know, the Prevagens and all that stuff.
I can't really comment on that. I mean, if they really worked, I think doctors would prescribe them. I think as long as they're not unsafe, I don't see a problem with taking them. I mean, I know an Alzheimer's researcher who takes them. That's one. But I can't really comment on whether or not it's a good idea. I would encourage instead doing the kind of things that they know reduces your risk. So not just exercise, but also good sleep, reducing anxiety, and exercising your brain, and not just like Sudoku or crossword puzzles, but things that are actually really taxing, like learning something new. In fact, I decided to pick the guitar back up, which I'd stopped playing 18 years ago when I was pregnant with my 4th child, and because I wanted to, tax my brain again. And I will say, it's much harder to learn now, but still, I think anything that you can do to keep engaged is probably going to be more effective than the current pills.
Does anyone have any other questions for Lauren? I know at one point we had about 20 people watching online, but I did not get emailed any questions, so far anyway. Lauren, let me ask you this. You've sort of given a brief overview of what the book's about, but why did you write the book, and how did this book come to be?
So, in reference to your personal story, my personal story. So I had, I think it was about 2009, an episode of sudden memory loss, which was different from amnesia, which is the inability to form new memories. I just had no idea who I was for a couple of minutes. I didn't know, I couldn't have told you my name. I didn't know where I was. I mean, all my senses were working, but I just was completely dropped into nothingness. And when it ended, I said, oh, I've got a bad ear infection, and took myself to the doctor, who said, oh, I think you're going to have seizures. I think you're having seizures. Anyway, so it's a type of seizure, and there's an abnormality in my brain that someone recommended that I get removed, and I didn't really like that idea. So I knew Jed Barish, and I said, would you look at this? I'm not sure what I want to do about it. And neurologists usually don't want to recommend surgery unless it's absolutely needed. So he looked at my scan and he said, you're fine, just take your medicine and you'll be fine, you don't need surgery. And he was right. So, whatever it is, 13 years later, I never had another seizure, and I'm fine, but it did leave me with this kind of fascination for weird brains and this visceral sense of how terrifying it is to lose your memory. And I also knew Barish to be a very careful, thoughtful doctor. So when he started finding these patients, I thought, wow, that's a really interesting story, and stories are how people, I think, understand science. So this could be a good book. If I'd known how hard it would have been, I'm not sure I would have done it, so.
So are you saying that writing a book is more difficult than producing a documentary?
Yes. Well, with a documentary, you're also working with other people, so it's a team effort, yeah.
Great. Well, last call for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Lauren? All right. Why don't you wrap us up, unless I get any more email questions.
So have they continued looking for people who have these memory issues? Like, I know Dayton, Ohio in particular was having a rash of opioid issues there just a few years ago, and they were having a lot of overdoses and people surviving. Have they heard of any more people, or to this day is it still just those 14?
Oh, no. So it's depending on, there's often data missing, like the MRI, but so at least 40 confirmed cases around the country and in some other countries. But I know there are more cases. For example, one of my husband's former patients, her parents called him and was like, she overdosed on something, she's in the hospital, and she can't remember anything. That's what happened to her. What are the odds that one other person would call my husband? I just think this is a really stigmatized population, and people chalk up their confusion, their memory problems to confusion, if they even go to the hospital, and then they go home. And so there are people out there who, have severe memory problems, and they're not getting cared for, and they don't know what happened to them, and neither do their families.
The list of 3 points that you bring out, those are just simply highlights. They're not like, this is the top 3 or anything.
It would be a couple of pages of different things that people are trying. I just couldn't go into all of it in the book, but it's reducing inflammation. There's lots of different, there's removing tau tangles instead of just the amyloid beta. And there's also one of the reasons scientists are more hopeful now is because they're designing much smarter clinical trials. Like the old clinical trials, they would often enroll people who didn't even have Alzheimer's because they wouldn't scan their brains. They would enroll people who had memory problems, but there can be other types of dementia that can cause memory problems. So of course you're not going to see efficacy for something that might help a little if 30% of your people don't even have the disease and aren't going to respond. But now they scan everyone, and now there's a new blood test coming up for tau tangles, so it'll be cheaper to enroll people. So they've gotten much better with clinical trials, but it'll take a while for that to kind of ripple through.
And the reason I ask about those 3 points is when you talk about exercise in a pill, you're kind of making both the scientific procedure they're doing and then pointing to the link to exercise in your lifestyle. So I was trying to figure out, well, when you say reduce hyperactivity in the hippocampus,
In the hippocampus.
are there things you can do? Should I go meditate?
No, they're not aware of things you can do. It's a normal feature of aging that the hippocampus gets more and more hyperactive. It's also what they think happens to the people with the amnestic syndrome, except it's not hyperactive. It's just like wild firing out of control so badly that a whole bunch of neurons die at the same time. But in people with early symptoms of Alzheimer's, that hyperactivity is much more acute. So the question is why, but if you can tamp it down, the hope is that it'll at least slow down the progression of the disease.
Okay, thank you.
All right, now I mean it. Last call for questions. All right, so let's give Lauren Aguirre a big round of applause for being with us today. Lauren, I hope we were an okay crowd for your very first author visit.
Very good, thank you
You
very
can cross
much.
this off your list, and for those who are interested, I'll keep the room open for another 10 to 20 minutes. If anyone wants to buy a copy of Lauren's book, it's the trade paperback edition. You can purchase a copy from Book Oasis and get it signed by Lauren. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the Corning Foundation. Thank you to Steve and Tewksbury Telemedia. Thanks to the Book Oasis, and most importantly, thanks to the audience in the room and watching at home. So everyone have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.